Shaq was enjoying a quiet afternoon when a furious cop did the unthinkable. He pulled out his gun and shot at a little black boy's toy car. The park fell dead silent. Parents gasped. Kids froze. But instead of backing down, Shaq stepped forward, towering over the officer with a look that could shatter stone. What he did next sent shockwaves across the country, cost the cop everything, and gave that little boy a gift he'd never forget. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Shaq had seen a lot in his life, but this was a new level of disgusting. The park had been peaceful just moments ago. Kids laughing, parents chatting under the warm afternoon sun. Families gathered near picnic tables, and joggers passed by enjoying the day. 6-year-old Malik was in his own little world, joyfully zooming his tiny red toy car across the pavement, his small hands guiding it as he made soft engine noises. His mother, Tasha, sat on a nearby bench, smiling as she watched her son play. It wasn't often they had the time to just enjoy a day outside together. That peace shattered in an instant. Officer Daniels, a tall, broad-shouldered cop with cold, steely eyes, had been patrolling the park. His uniform looked crisp, but his expression was anything but welcoming. When Malik's toy car accidentally rolled near his feet, his lips curled into a sneer. "Keep that junk away from me, kid," he muttered, his voice dripping with annoyance. Malik's small face scrunched up in worry as he quickly reached for his toy. "Sorry, sir." Bang! A gunshot ripped through the air. Mothers screamed. Fathers grabbed their kids. Birds took off from the trees in a flurry. Malik stood frozen in place, his wide, innocent eyes locked onto the shattered remains of his toy car. The plastic had exploded into tiny fragments, scattered across the pavement. Smoke still curled from the barrel of Officer Daniel's gun. Tasha bolted from the bench, her breath coming in short gasps. "Oh my God, Malik!" She scooped her son into her arms, frantically checking him for injuries. Malik trembled, his tiny hands gripping her sweater, unable to process what had just happened. Daniel smirked. "That's what happens when you don't listen." People stared in horror. A few had their phones out, recording. Others were too shocked to move. And then, a shadow loomed over Daniels. Slowly the officer turned, his smirk faltering as his gaze traveled upward. Shaquille O'Neal stood before him, his massive frame towering over the cop like an immovable force. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something dangerous. His voice was low, steady, and filled with barely contained rage. "Tell me you didn't just do that." Officer Daniels stood frozen, his smug expression fading the moment he turned and saw the towering figure before him. The laughter and chatter in the park had died down, replaced by hushed whispers rippling through the crowd. Parents clutched their children's hands tighter. A man near the swings leaned toward his wife and murmured, "Wait, is that Shaquille O'Neal?" Shaq's massive frame cast a long shadow over the officer, his arms crossed, his expression stone cold. His deep voice cut through the silence like a blade. "So you bring a gun to a toy fight now?" Daniel stiffened, his fingers twitching slightly at his side. His years on the force had conditioned him to respond with authority, to assert control, but something about the way Shaq stood, unshaken, unmoving, made his usual tactics feel useless. He cleared his throat, lifting his chin. "Step back, sir. This is police business." Shaq let out a slow, disbelieving chuckle. "Police business? That's what you call pulling a gun on a 6-year-old? His eyes flicked to the shattered remains of Malik's toy car, then back to Daniel's. "Let me guess. He looked dangerous?" Daniel shifted his weight uneasily, his grip tightening on his belt. The boy, he needed to be taught a lesson about listening to authority. His voice wavered, but he pressed on. "You don't understand how hard it is keeping the streets safe. Sometimes—" Shaq cut him off, stepping closer, until the officer had no choice but to look up at him. "Or what? You gonna shoot me next?" Daniel's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. His gaze darted around, realizing how many phones were pointed in his direction. The crowd was growing. People were recording. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. He needed a way out. His hand shot to his radio. "I need backup at the park," he muttered quickly. Shaq smirked, shaking his head in disbelief. "Oh, now you need backup?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. "You weren't so scared when you pulled your gun on a kid." A murmur ran through the crowd. Parents exchanged glances, their anger simmering just below the surface. A woman near the picnic tables called out, "Yeah, call your little friends. Let's see them try to defend this." Daniel's face reddened, but he didn't acknowledge her. His grip on his radio tightened. Shaq uncrossed his arms, his stance widening just slightly, exuding nothing but control. "Go ahead, call whoever you want," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "But I promise you, no one's coming to save you from this." Daniel swallowed hard. He had made a terrible mistake, and it was far from over. Daniels lifted his radio to his lips, his voice low but urgent. "I got a situation at Greenway Park, requesting immediate backup." His hand trembled slightly as he spoke, though he tried to mask it by standing taller. He expected to feel a surge of relief after making the call, but instead, an unsettling feeling crept over him. Shaq let out a slow, amused chuckle, shaking his head. "A situation?" He gestured toward the wreckage of the toy car, then at the terrified little boy clutching his mother's leg. "This is what you call a situation?" His voice was laced with sarcasm, but beneath it was an edge, one that sent a chill through the officer's spine. Daniels clenched his jaw, ignoring the murmurs growing louder around him. "Sir, I'm asking you one last time, step back." Shaq didn't move. Instead, he took a deliberate step forward, forcing Daniels to look up at him. "And I'm telling you," Shaq said, his voice lowering, "that's not happening." The crowd had doubled in size now, mothers holding their children close, fathers stepping forward, their expressions hard. More phones were raised, capturing every second. The tension in the air thickened, an electric charge ready to explode. A woman near the swings scoffed loudly. "Back up? For what? To help you threaten more kids?" A man near the picnic tables called out, "Yeah, call all your little cop buddies. We're watching everything." Daniels turned his head slightly, scanning the sea of phones locked on him, but before he could react, Shaq reached into his pocket. Daniels' hand shot toward his holster, but Shaq simply pulled out his phone, flipped the camera on, and aimed it right at the officer's face. "Since you like attention so much," Shaq said, tilting his head, "how about we make you famous?" Daniels froze, his breath catching in his throat. The live stream had just begun, and thousands were already watching. Shaq adjusted the angle of his phone, making sure Officer Daniels' face was clearly visible on the live stream. Within seconds, the viewer count began to skyrocket, numbers climbing at an astonishing rate as thousands tuned in. The comment section was already flooded with outrage, disbelief, and calls for justice. "Is this real? That cop really pulled a gun on a toy? Shaq, make sure this guy never wears a badge again." Shaq's deep voice carried authority, but there was an unmistakable edge of fury beneath his calm demeanor. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens in our communities," he said, panning the camera slightly to capture the wreckage of Malik's toy car, now shattered across the pavement. The little boy clung to his mother's side, his small hands gripping the fabric of her dress, as if letting go would make everything worse. Tasha stroked his back gently, trying to comfort him, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her anger. Shaq turned the camera back to Daniels, his expression darkening. A grown man, a trained officer of the law. "And this is what he does?" He shook his head slowly. "He pulls a gun on a damn toy?" Daniel's face twitched, his smirk now completely gone. His eyes flickered between the growing crowd, the phones pointed at him, and Shaq's unwavering presence in front of him. He stepped forward, lifting a hand as if to reach for Shaq's phone. "Turn that off," he ordered, his voice laced with desperation rather than authority. Shaq didn't even blink. He tightened his grip on his phone, keeping it steady. "Nah, I don't think I will." A murmur spread through the crowd, a ripple of defiance that only grew stronger. A young woman wearing a denim jacket raised her own phone higher, ensuring she captured every second. "What's wrong, officer? You weren't so nervous when you pulled a gun on a child." A man from the back of the crowd scoffed. "Yeah, how's it feel to have everyone watching you now?" Daniel's breath quickened. His fingers twitched toward his radio, and for the first time, the confidence he had wielded so arrogantly just moments ago began to crumble. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke into his radio. "Unit 12, I need backup." The response was almost immediate, but it wasn't what he wanted to hear. "Unit 12, clarify the nature of the emergency." "Over." Daniels hesitated, glancing around at the countless phones still recording his every move. Beads of sweat formed at his temple as the reality of the situation settled in. This wasn't going away. More notifications flashed across Shaq's screen. "CNN just picked this up. TMZ is sharing your live feed. His career is over. Shaq's gaze never wavered as he folded his arms across his broad chest. Yeah, you're screwed now. Then in the distance, a chilling sound filled the air. Police sirens, growing louder by the second. The crowd parted slightly, heads turning toward the flashing lights approaching fast. The tension in the air snapped like a wire stretched too tight. Daniel swallowed hard, his hands clenched at his sides, but the confidence he had carried so arrogantly before was completely shattered. He knew, just like everyone else watching, that the situation had spiraled far beyond his control. Inside the bustling police precinct, the low hum of voices and ringing phones filled the air, but all of it faded into background noise as Chief Dawson's eyes locked onto the screen of his desktop. His jaw clenched tighter with every passing second of the live stream playing in front of him. The image was shaky, filmed from multiple angles, but there was no mistaking what was happening. Officer Daniels, gun drawn, a shot fired, a child crying, and then Shaquille O'Neal stepping forward like an immovable force. The tension in the room was thick, and officers passing by instinctively slowed their pace, sensing the storm brewing in their superior. A young deputy, barely out of academy training, hesitantly approached Dawson's desk. Sir, he started, shifting nervously. This is, getting bad. The video's already hit 100,000 views. Dawson inhaled sharply through his nose, nostrils flaring as he turned his head to glare at the screen again. The comments were flooding in at lightning speed. Fire him now. This is why we don't trust cops. That man should be in handcuffs, not a uniform. A sick feeling curled in Dawson's gut. He knew public outrage when he saw it. And this was worse than anything he'd dealt with in years. His grip tightened around the armrest of his chair before he abruptly pushed himself up to his feet, his broad frame radiating tension. Where the hell is Daniels right now? He demanded. The deputy swallowed. Still at the park, sir. O'Neal's got him cornered. The whole place is surrounded by people filming. Dawson didn't let him finish. He grabbed his coat off the back of his chair and strode toward the exit with purpose. Get in the car. We're handling this now. His voice carried through the precinct like a commandment, leaving no room for argument. Several officers exchanged uneasy glances before scrambling to follow orders. As Dawson threw open the door and stepped outside, the distant wail of sirens confirmed what he already knew. This wasn't just another PR headache. This was a full-blown crisis. He yanked open the driver's side door of his SUV, slid inside, and started the engine with a forceful turn of the key. He didn't need to check the GPS. He already knew exactly where he was going. As the tires screeched against the pavement, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. Daniels had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and Dawson was about to make sure he paid for it. Daniels' breathing was shallow as he stood in the center of the crowd, his usual air of authority slipping with every passing second. The murmurs around him were growing louder, the weight of dozens of phone cameras aimed in his direction, making his uniform feel tighter than ever. His fingers twitched at his sides as his mind scrambled for a way out. I didn't mean to, Daniel started, his voice cracking under the pressure. But before he could finish, a deep, unshaken voice cut through the noise like a blade. Nah, Shaq said, stepping forward, his massive frame blocking out the afternoon sun. His arms were crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. Say that again. For the camera, Daniel's throat went dry. He could feel the sweat beating on the back of his neck, rolling down beneath his collar. He looked around, desperately searching for someone, anyone, to back him up, but all he saw were cold, furious eyes watching him like a predator stalking its prey. The park, which had once felt like his domain, was now a hostile battlefield. Mothers clutched their children closer, their expressions filled with rage and disgust. A teenage boy whispered something to his friend, shaking his head. An older man near the bench muttered, "Coward?" Daniel's hands curled into fists, his desperation morphing into weak indignation. "This is being blown out of proportion," he tried, his voice shaking but still clinging to authority. Before he could finish, the wail of a siren pierced the tension. Heads turned toward the entrance of the park as a police cruiser screeched to a stop, its tires kicking up dust. The driver's side door was thrown open, and out stepped Chief Dawson, his face as stormy as the sky before a hurricane. Daniel's heart dropped into his stomach. His backup had arrived, but not for him. The second Chief Dawson stepped out of his cruiser. The entire park seemed to hold its breath. The man was built like an old war tank. Broad shoulders, heavy steps, and a face lined with years of stress. But today, his usual controlled demeanor was gone. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles twitched, and his eyes locked onto Daniel's, with the kind of fury that made even the most hardened officers shrink. He didn't walk. He stormed. His heavy boots stomped against the pavement as he closed the distance, his voice booming across the park before he even reached them. "Officer Daniels, what did you do?" Daniels jolted, his spine stiffening like a soldier caught out of line. His lips parted, searching for an excuse, for something that would undo the mess he had just made. "Sir, I was just..." "Don't!" Dawson sliced the air with his hand, shutting him up before he could dig his hole any deeper. His chest rose and fell with barely contained rage, but it was the way his eyes flicked to the surrounding crowd. Phones still recording, mothers holding their kids protectively, Malik standing there wide-eyed. That told him all he needed to know. Dawson's face darkened further. He exhaled sharply through his nose before turning to the only man in the park who could possibly make the situation worse or better. Shaq, the basketball legend, stood with his arms crossed, unmoving as a stone monument. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone had completely shifted the power dynamic. The air around him felt heavy, commanding, as if even the trees in the park leaned in to listen. Dawson's voice lowered, but his tone remained firm. "Tell me everything." Shaq tilted his head slightly, eyes glinting with something between amusement and contempt. He let the silence drag for just a second longer than necessary, enough to make Daniels visibly sweat. Then, with a slow smirk spreading across his face, Shaq said, "Gladly." The tension in the park was thick enough to cut with a knife. Parents clutched their children, their eyes bouncing between Chief Dawson, Officer Daniels, and Shaq, who stood like an immovable force of nature. Cameras were still rolling, their red recording lights blinking like warning signals. Every second of this was being broadcasted to the world. Shaq's voice broke through the silence, deep and unwavering. "You got two options." He took a step forward, towering over Dawson and Daniels. "Fire him." His eyes flicked to the trembling officer, who had suddenly found it difficult to breathe. "Or deal with me." Dawson shifted uncomfortably. He was a seasoned officer, a man who had dealt with criminals, press conferences, and political blowback. But this was something different. Shaq wasn't just a celebrity, he was a cultural force. If he took this to social media, it wouldn't just be a scandal. It would be an all-out war against the department. Dawson cleared his throat. "Mr. O'Neill, I understand your concern, but I can't just..." Shaq cut him off by lifting his phone. The screen was still streaming live, thousands of furious comments pouring in every second. He turned it toward Dawson, letting him see the chaos unfolding in real time. "Fire him now. This is sick. How is this even a debate? We need accountability. No more excuses." "Shaq, don't let them sweep this under the rug." Shaq's gaze was locked onto Dawson. 10 million people say you don't need an investigation. His voice carried the weight of every injustice, every moment of frustration that people had felt when those in power tried to stall and cover up the truth. Dawson's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked at Daniels, who was still standing there, his face drained of all color. His hands were shaking, his fingers twitching as if he was still gripping a gun. The chief exhaled slowly, the pressure of the moment finally breaking him. He knew what had to be done. "Fine." His voice was barely above a whisper, but then he straightened his back and cleared his throat. "Fine," he repeated louder this time. He turned to Daniels, his expression unreadable. "Officer Daniels, you're done." Daniels' eyes widened in sheer panic. "Wait, what?" "Sir, you can't..." Dawson didn't let him finish. "Badge and gun." Now a murmur rippled through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Malik's tiny hands gripped his mother's as he watched in silence. Shaq's smirk deepened as Daniels stammered. The officer looked around wildly, searching for someone to save him, to defend him, but there was no one. Daniel's breath hitched as he realized the full weight of the moment. His career was over. The entire park seemed to hold its breath as Chief Dawson's voice rang out with absolute finality. "Officer Daniels," he said, his face devoid of any sympathy. "Badge and gun." Now for a second, Daniels didn't move. His fingers twitched at his holster, as if instinctively reaching for the weapon he no longer had the right to carry. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes darted between Dawson, Shaq, and the sea of recording phones capturing every second of his downfall. "You can't be serious," Daniels finally sputtered. his voice a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "Sir, I was just doing my job. This is all being blown out of proportion." Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, he's dead serious." He folded his massive arms over his chest, towering over Daniels like a judge delivering a sentence. "And so is the whole world watching this live." Dawson didn't budge. His jaw was clenched tight, his patience worn down to nothing. "I said, badge and gun." Now Daniel's breathing grew shallow. His hands trembled as he unfastened the holster and placed his service weapon into Dawson's waiting hand. The badge was next. He hesitated, gripping it tightly, as if still clinging to some last shred of authority. "Come on," Dawson snapped. "You're not a cop anymore." A few officers stepped forward, ready to take Daniels into custody. The former officer's face turned red, a cocktail of humiliation, rage, and panic boiling inside him. "This is bullsh." "Save it," Shaq cut in, his voice sharp as a blade. "You thought you were untouchable, huh? Thought you could pull your gun on a little kid and get away with it?" He shook his head. "Not today." The onlookers, who had been watching in stunned silence, suddenly erupted into murmurs of approval. A few even clapped. Mothers hugged their children tighter, relieved that, for once, justice was swift. Daniel's lips curled in frustration as two officers grabbed his arms and began leading him toward a squad car. The flashing red and blue lights painted his pale face in alternating hues of disgrace. As the door slammed shut behind him, Daniels felt the crushing weight of what just happened. His career, his power, his reputation, it was all gone. And worst of all, the whole world saw it happen. The tense atmosphere of the park began to shift as Officer Daniels disappeared into the squad car. The weight of injustice that had loomed over the scene started to lift, but for one little boy, the damage was already done. Shaq turned, his towering frame moving with an unexpected gentleness as he walked toward Malik. The 6-year-old stood motionless, his tiny hands still trembling from the trauma of what had just happened. His toy car, his favorite, his prized possession, lay in shattered pieces on the pavement. His mother knelt beside him, holding him close, whispering words of comfort, but his wide, teary eyes stayed locked on the broken plastic and smoldering rubber. Shaq crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's level. "You good, little man?" His deep voice was softer now, filled with warmth and reassurance. Malik sniffled and rubbed at his face, trying to be brave. He broke my car." His voice cracked as fresh tears welled up in his eyes. Shaq nodded, glancing at the wreckage of the toy. He exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "Yeah, he did. And that ain't right." He placed a massive hand on Malik's small shoulder. "But let me ask you something." Malik blinked up at him. "You like Lamborghinis?" The little boy's eyes widened instantly. His sniffles paused as curiosity took over his sadness. He looked up at Shaq, unsure if he had heard correctly. Lamborghinis?" Shaq grinned. "Yeah, the real fast ones. You ever wanted one?" Malik's head nodded so fast it was almost a blur. "Yeah," Shaq chuckled, ruffling the boy's curls. "Good, 'cause I think I got an idea." Malik's mother frowned in confusion, while the gathered crowd leaned in, sensing something big was about to happen. Shaq pulled out his phone and made a call. "Yo, I need a favor, and it's gotta be big." The morning sun cast a golden hue over the neighborhood as Tasha sleepily walked to the front door, rubbing her eyes. A loud knock had startled her and Malik awake, and she wasn't expecting visitors. Malik, still in his dinosaur pajamas, clutched her hand, his small face filled with curiosity. As she pulled open the door, she froze. Parked right outside their home was the sleekest, shiniest, most incredible toy car she had ever seen. It was a custom electric mini Lamborghini, jet black with golden rims, a tiny spoiler at the back, and even the number 34 printed on the hood, a tribute to Shaq's legendary career. And standing right beside it, arms crossed and grinning ear to ear, was Shaquille O'Neal himself. Malik's jaw dropped. His little hands flew to his face, and he let out a scream so loud that the entire block probably heard it. "Mom! Mom, look!" Tasha covered her mouth, tears already forming in her eyes as she looked at Shaq in disbelief. "No, you didn't," Shaq chuckled. "Oh, I did." Malik jumped up and down, his excitement uncontrollable. "That's mine. That's really mine." Shaq knelt down and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a tiny key fob, complete with a remote start button. He held it out to Malik with a wink. Think you can handle this, lil man? Malik stared at the keys like they were made of pure gold. Slowly, as if afraid the dream would vanish, he reached out and took them. His fingers curled around the fob, gripping it tightly. This is the best day ever, he shouted, running straight for the car. Tasha wiped a tear from her cheek, shaking her head in awe. Shaq, I don't even know what to say. Shaq placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Say this, he said with a smile, nodding toward her son, that no matter how bad things get, there's always good people out here willing to make it right. Malik pressed the start button, and the tiny Lamborghini purred to life. Shaq smirked, leaning down one last time. Drive safe, lil man. The world had moved on, but Officer Daniels hadn't. Months had passed since the park incident, and his once confident smirk was long gone. The viral footage of him shooting a child's toy car had spread like wildfire, turning him into a national disgrace. Fired, disgraced, and blacklisted from every police department in the state, he found himself desperate, clutching a crumpled resume as he stepped into a small convenience store, hoping for a fresh start. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Daniels approached the counter, forcing a smile at the manager, a balding man with thick glasses. Hi, I saw the now hiring sign. I'd love to apply for... The manager squinted, tilting his head. His expression shifted from polite indifference to sharp recognition. Hold up. I know you. Daniels stiffened. His palms began to sweat. No, I don't think we've met. The manager snapped his fingers. Nah, man, you're that guy. The cop who shot a dang toy. That was you. His voice carried through the store, drawing the attention of a few customers. A young woman near the chips aisle gasped. Wait, oh my God, that is him. Daniel's throat went dry as whispers spread. He could feel eyes drilling into him. The manager shook his head, disgusted. Sorry, pal, we don't hire people like you. He grabbed the now hiring sign and yanked it down right in front of him. Daniels opened his mouth to argue, but he knew it was useless. Shoulders slumped, he turned and trudged toward the exit, his boots heavy against the tile floor. As he pushed open the glass door, a sleek black car sat idling at the curb. Inside, Shaq leaned back in the driver's seat, watching. He had seen everything. A slow, knowing smirk spread across his face as he shook his head. Daniels locked eyes with him, shame burning in his gut. Shaq rolled down the window, voice smooth and amused. Karma, baby. With that, Shaq drove off into the night, knowing justice had been served, not just for Malik, but for every kid who deserved better.